So imagine this. You're on the ward, and you see a textbook perfect case, a really rare dermatological finding, a proper medical unicorn.
Right.
And your first thought is, I have to get a picture of this for teaching. But you pause just before you tap that camera icon. What are the absolute, immediate, ethical, and legal steps you have to take?
That pause. That's everything, isn't it? That's the moment of professional judgment. You've just hit on the core conflict. The value of that image for education versus the patient's absolute right to privacy.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling the full GMC guidance on making and using visual and audio recordings of patients, which a listener sent in. This whole area is, well, it's a huge point of anxiety in exams like the MSRA
All right.
SJT.
Absolutely, because it's all about balancing consent, confidentiality, and capacity, usually under some kind of time pressure.
So our mission today is to cut through all that complexity and just get to the core truths.
And if there's one single idea to hold on to, it's this. A recording, whether it's a photo or a sound file, is a medical record. Simple as that.
A medical record.
You have to treat it with the exact same confidentiality, the same security, and the same respect for the patient's autonomy as you would their private clinical notes.
Okay, let's unpack that, because the first big hurdle is knowing when consent is already part of the care and when you need to stop and have a completely separate conversation. This is the purpose test, right?
Exactly. The POPIS is what determines the level of consent you need. So if the recording is an integral part of their investigation or their treatment, consent is generally considered implicit.
Implicit within the overall consent for that procedure.
Yes.
So what are we talking about here? What falls into that bucket?
Well, the obvious things are images of internal organs during surgery, X-rays, ultrasound scans, laparoscopic footage, pathology slides.
All of the stuff that's essential for their clinical journey.
Precisely. You consented to the operation, so you've implicitly consented to the necessary visual records of that operation being made for your file.
That makes sense. But let's go back to my rare skin finding. I've taken the photo for the medical record. Implicit consent is fine. But now I want to use it in a big presentation. Does that implicit consent still cover me?
No, absolutely not. The purpose has completely changed.
Yeah.
The second you decide to use that recording for a secondary purpose, so teaching, research, and assessment, you have to either fully anonymize it or code it before you use it. You've moved it from a private clinical file into a different domain.
And that needs another layer of protection.
A much stronger layer.
Okay, and what if I'm making a recording specifically for teaching, like filming a patient doing their physio exercises post-op? That's never for their direct care.
That's mandatory specific consent.
Yeah.
Right from the start. And while you can get oral consent if you record it, the guidance really pushes for written consent in these cases. You need a clear record of that conversation.
And for the SJT, what are the absolute non-negotiables you have to cover in that conversation?
3 things. 1, the precise purpose. What exactly will this be used for? 2, the storage and security. How long are you keeping it? Who sees it? And 3, their unconditional right to say no or to change their mind later.
And you have to make it crystal clear that saying no won't affect their care one bit.
That's crucial. There can be zero pressure. None at all.
You know, instead of trying to memorize all 8 of the GMC's principles as a list, it feels like they cluster into a few big themes.
Well, they really do. I think you can boil them all down to 3 pillars: autonomy, transparency, and security.
Okay.
Autonomy is the patient's control. They're fully informed, they're not under pressure, and they can stop the recording at any time. Transparency is us being honest about exactly how it's going to be used.
And security covers the storage, the disclosure, who gets to see it. So that brings us back to anonymization, which sounds simple, but is it? If I've got a super rare case that's just, cropping out the face enough.
That is the practical trap. The guidance specifically warns that seemingly insignificant details can still identify a patient.
Like what?
A unique scar next to the clinical finding, a specific tattoo, the location of the finding itself. If it's rare enough, a colleague could easily figure out who the patient is. Anonymized means completely unlinkable.
Okay, what about this other term, coded or pseudonymized? Why would you code something instead of just making it fully anonymous?
You code information when you might need to link it back to the patient later. There's a key held securely that allows you to do that.
So for things like a long-term clinical trial.
Exactly. Or a clinical audit. You need to know that this data point came from patient X because you might need to check their future outcomes. You're sacrificing that absolute anonymity for the ability to do vital longitudinal follow-up.
Right, that makes perfect sense. Let's move on to high-risk groups. This is where consent gets really complicated and shifts towards capacity. What happens if an adult lacks capacity to consent to a recording for, say, an educational purpose?
Then the process gets much, much stricter. You have to follow the relevant legislation, like the Mental Capacity Act. The decision maker has to be completely satisfied that making the recording is necessary and that it's in the patient's best interests.
Or that it directly benefits them somehow.
Yes, and crucially, that you couldn't achieve the same goal in a less restrictive way. Their rights are paramount, even when capacity is gone.
And what about children and young people? We always hear about Gillick competence.
It's the same principle. If a child under 16 is Gillick competent, if they have the understanding to make the decision, then they can consent themselves. We'd always encourage involving parents, but the child's confident decision is the one that matters.
And if they lack capacity?
Then consent has to come from someone with parental responsibility.
Okay, but here's the classic SJT trap. The parent gives full consent, but during the recording, the child gets upset and says, "Stop." What's the immediate correct action?
You stop immediately, no question.
Even with parental consent in your back pocket.
It doesn't matter. The child's immediate welfare and their distress overrides any prior consent. If they object, if they look distressed, if the parent asks you to stop, you stop the recording, period.
That feels like a really clear rule. Which brings us to the area with the highest bar of all. Recordings that are going to be on public media. TV, the internet, YouTube.
For public media, you have to be unbelievably vigilant. Because once it's out there, you've lost all control.
So what's the rule?
The consent must be obtained, and it really should be in writing. And this is the key bit. Even if you, the doctor, think the patient is totally unidentifiable.
Wow, okay. And you have to make sure they understand the risks, which are huge.
Yes. They need to know that once they agree, they probably can't stop that TV company from using the footage again and again. If they want to restrict its future use, they need to get a separate legal agreement with the production company before anything is filmed.
And even if the patient has signed everything, the doctor still has the final say. The ethical veto.
100%. Your primary duty is always to the patient. If you feel for a second that the recording is becoming intrusive or exploitative or damaging to them, you withdraw your cooperation instantly, regardless of any consent form.
Okay, let's touch on the really extreme cases. Covert recordings. This has to be the default wrong answer in almost any exam scenario.
Almost universally, yes. Recording someone without their knowledge is prohibited. It is only permissible in the absolute rarest of circumstances.
Such as?
To investigate or prosecute a serious crime, or to protect someone from serious harm, like a major child safeguarding issue. And even then,
It's not something a doctor should be doing on their own.
no. You must seek legal authorization. The guidance is clear that in most cases this should be done by the police or another legal authority. A doctor going it alone with a hidden camera is stepping into a professional minefield. You discuss it, you escalate it, you get independent advice.
Finally, what about after a patient has died? Our duty of confidentiality doesn't end.
It continues. Any recordings made when the patient was alive must follow their known wishes. If you want to use anonymous recordings for secondary purposes, that's generally fine.
But what if it's identifiable and you want to put it in the public domain?
Then you must consult the patient's family. Especially if it involves sensitive information like genetics, that could affect them. And in those cases, you should always be seeking legal advice from your trust or your employer.
And just quickly, postmortems, do you need consent for those recordings?
If the recording is integral to figuring out the cause of death, no, you don't need separate consent. But if you want to use any images from that postmortem for a secondary purpose like teaching, you have to make sure they're fully anonymized, unless you get specific consent at the time.
Okay, this has been a huge amount of detail. We need to boil it down. What are the 3 absolute practical rules a listener can take away and apply tomorrow?
Good idea. Okay, rule 1. Always apply the purpose test. Ask yourself, is this for direct clinical care or is it for a secondary use? That question dictates everything else.
Perfect. Rule 2.
Patient veto always trumps all. Doesn't matter who gave consent, the patient, a parent, a lawyer. If the patient themselves objects or shows distress, you stop immediately. Their right to withdraw is absolute.
Yeah, and the 3rd takeaway.
Public media requires legal vigilance. The moment an image is heading for a wide public audience, you need written consent. And you must be prepared to be the patient's advocate and pull the plug if their best interests are at risk. That's the highest ethical bar.
This guidance was updated pretty recently in 2024. And when you think about AI and how it could potentially re-identify people from tiny bits of data or create deepfakes, it brings up a huge question.
It does.
How are we going to balance the incredible potential of using huge health data sets to benefit everyone against the absolute right of an individual patient to privacy and control over their own image, especially in this incredibly visual, tech-driven world?
The rules are always playing catch-up with the technology, aren't they? Which means our fundamental ethical duty to protect the patient's dignity. That has to be the one constant that we as doctors hold on to.
Something to think about. Thank you for joining us on the deep dive.